Пані та панове, дозвольте представити вам учасників нашого наступного прес-брифінгу. Це Svitlana Zalishchuk.
Let me introduce to you participants in the briefing. Svitlana Zalishchuk, CHESNO movement, Yegor Sobolev, who is representative of social initiative VOLIA, and Yevgen Radchenko, who is expert of the rehabilitation package of reforms.
Our next speakers, it's going to be Svitlana Zalishchuk, CHESNO movement, Yegor Sobolev, the representative of the Civic Illustration Committee of Ukraine, and Yevgen Radchenko, the development director of the ICO Internews Ukraine. They're going to be discussing the issue of results of the parliamentary voting on the draft laws amending the electoral legislation.
Шановні колеги,
Dear colleagues, good afternoon. We wanted to make an analysis of today's plenary session of the Parliament. We will start with what has happened to the illustration law. Yegor Sobolev starts. The law on the purification of power has seen nothing good yet. You know that the Parliament refused to even consider this law. This shows that what we've been feeling for several months, that the forces of the majority and government and the people who now hold power in Ukraine, they do not want the purification of power. Just 180 votes for consideration of this law testifies to this very clearly. Just the Svoboda party has voted in full for the law, and Batkivshina and Udar have not added any votes. For instance, Mykola Katerenchuk did not vote even for the inclusion of the draft law on the agenda. And this means that in police, in security service, in the general staff, there will remain the agents of Putin. The law suggests de-KGBization of Ukrainian law enforcement bodies, and Putin and KGB is still the source of biggest influence on Ukraine. And now, you know, hundreds of people who willingly served Yanukovych want to serve the new authorities if they are allowed to rob the people. There are hundreds of thousands of thugs and judges' mentals who are willing to serve again if they are allowed to bend the law. And this leads, regrettably, to the further radicalization of people. I talked to hundreds of people close to the parliament today, telling them, no, we cannot storm the parliament, we cannot burn the parliament until we cope with the foreign aggression. And I tell them that now, during the war of independence, we should not raise the revolution in Kiev. But the people say, but there's nothing gonna happen. We see that those MPs just spit on us. As a result, we had clashes. I had to stop several clashes within half a day, although there are Maidan veterans in the ranks of police with whom we easily find common language, but of course there are some fruits who are provoking those clashes. 2 Kharkiv activists were detained just a couple of moments ago. They didn't do anything illegal. They were just walking with banners with Ukrainian flags in the park. Mr. Koloti and Mr. Halilov. I talked to the new head of the Department for Public Security in Kiev, so that he does not provoke clashes, but he said that he's now got more on his hands. How can we exit this CHESNO position, and how can we turn the situation back to solutions and to success? Very simply, the parliament is gathering again. We ask them to vote for this law, and formally nothing hinders this. There are signatures of all the leaders of the coalition, and the Minister of Justice, Mr. Petrenko, supported it, and very many public organizations supported them. From Aftermaidan to self-defense, please vote and start the purification of authorities. Otherwise, the people will be disenchanted more and more. They will become angry and angrier, and they will attack the new police and the new powers that be. The last thing I want to say, I want to ask the Kievans, first of all, to come to the parliament, because it is very important that MPs feel that they are under the public control before the elections, and every MP who does not support the law on the purification of power won't be elected. This should be a yardstick for every MP, whether they really wanted lustration or whether they blocked it. We're asking every journalist, and we also, as public activists, will spread this information so that every MP who blocks lustration is illustrated during the elections. And my colleagues will tell you about the elections. Our second issue is the situation around the election law. Yevgen Radchenko. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Continuing the words of Yegor Sobolev, I must tell you that the situation on election law is almost similar to the illustration law, maybe even worse a bit, because legislators today were not able to put on the agenda not a single draft law on the election of MPs. As we know, there are now legal grounds for the president to assemble the parliament and to appoint the new parliamentary elections. More than that, it is the society who demand this, and this was one of the promises of Mr. Poroshenko when he ran for the presidency. Today, the MPs with 167 votes did not include on the agenda the long ago promised draft laws that would be organizing the elections according to open party lists. After this, they did not include on the agenda two drafts of election codes, 4010 and 4010A. They were not able even to put on the agenda cosmetic changes suggested by Mr. Rutkovsky, who has just changed the election threshold from 5 to 3%. They were not able to include the draft authored by Sobolev, Chernovolenko, Pavlovsky, which is about proportional representation, but still it provided for some seeming openness of electoral lists. After this, they tried to include two draft laws whose authors are Sobolev and Ivanchuk Kinohiremeev. Those two draft laws were developed and introduced to the parliament today. Their texts are even absent from the database of the parliament, and we cannot even talk about any transparency connected to the drafting of this law. But as a result, these draft laws are not included on the agenda as well. So today we have the biggest possibility that the elections will be held according to the current legislation, which provides for the parallel system, while 225 are elected according to proportional to party lists with a 5% threshold, and 225 are elected in territorial constituencies according to first past the post. In practice, this means that in Crimea there will be formal election constituencies, but MPs won't be elected there, and this means that we won't have the constitutional composition of the parliament, 450 MPs. Next thing, the current law on elections provides for 60 days of election campaign, and of course we should forget now about 30 or 45 days of election campaign. This is impossible during under current legislation. Again, according to the law that exists, in order to print the bulletins we need 23 days, but in practice we need a minimum of 38 days. So there is no time to print bulletins even according to this law. I don't even mention the formation of electoral commissions. At the moment, the law provides for rather serious guarantees for political parties and candidates. This means that the elections won't become cheaper, and we don't have where to take money for this. To sum up, the MPs have tried to select the worst path to the elections, and continuing this absolutely optimistic note, allow me to answer the question what the citizens should do. Under the conditions where we won't be able to change any election law to introduce positive changes that we were talking a lot about, what can we do as citizens and voters? The CHESNO movement suggests that we do 4 things that can influence and make a bit more transparent these elections. First, we demand that the parties and nominees publish their sources of financing of this political campaign. As we have already said, the current legislation does not regulate this issue, and it is one of the worst in Europe, although we should say that we have reached some positive shifts during the presidential elections 2014, when we demanded that presidential candidates publish their intermediary reports so that the voter could see who financed the candidate and how they used the money. And this, of course, increased the ability of the voter to see who stands behind the candidates. We should say that Poroshenko, Tymoshenko, Radchenko, and Bohomolets did open their financial documents, although the legislation did not demand this. We will put this demand in front of our politicians again, and we hope that the politicians will show us whether they did get money for this campaign. We will demand also, secondly, that those who see themselves MPs in the future show their declarations, income declarations. I want to inform the journalists that today we have anti-corruption legislation that obliges MPs to publish their income declarations on the site of the parliament. However, less than 100 MPs did this. So in spite of the promises of the former opposition who are now in power, we still don't have declarations on the site. According to the current legislation, which we think is one of the worst options for conducting these elections, they really do not oblige the nominees to show their declarations on during early elections. This is our second demand. If you are a candidate, if you want people to support you, especially after Euromaidan. Please show your declaration. Third, today, you know that open lists were one of the major demands of Euromaidan and one of the most popular promises of presidential candidates. The CHESNO movement will insist that parties open their lists of candidates before the Congress votes for them and before they are registered by the Central Electoral Commission, which will allow the citizens and society to get involved in the discussion and to show whether the candidates are worthy of trust. Our fourth demand is the publication of biography. Very often we see that full-scope biographies are not there on the site of the Central Electoral Commission. You most often see a short synopsis. He was born there and then he works there, but there is no detailed biography about their trust, about their, so to say, credit history, where they worked. We will seek this goodwill from the political forces to open their biographies and see and show them to the voters. We, as the CHESNO movement, undertake to inform the voters as much as possible. We see that there is no political will to do this, but we will ask everyone how they are personally ready to open this information. Apart from everything else, we are going to create a blacklist which will hold all the current MPs who voted for dictatorship laws and who also were involved in corruption cases, corroborated by well-known Ukrainian journalists and media. And to sum it up, I'll tell you, I and Yegor Sobolev stood there. He's got a brilliant T-shirt. We demand lustration. I also have some T-shirts about media transparency and all this, and I saw that, regrettably, those T-shirts are still topical. As a public activist, as a journalist, I would like to throw them away from my stock of T-shirts, so that because they would have become non-topical. We will lobby the legislation. We will not sit on our hands, so that the next parliament is going to vote for them. Also, another speaker arrived. This is Agnieszka Jasecka from the Open Dialogue Foundation. Just 2 minutes about Agnieszka. She and her foundation are doing a huge work that helps Europe to understand why Ukraine needs the purification of authority. You don't know about this, but in many European countries, the Ukrainian lustration is a scarecrow. They say that this is political persecution, that we actually persecute people for poems by Pushkin. So the Foundation Open Dialogue have voluntarily undertaken to explain in Europe what's happening in Ukraine. They made translations into 8 languages. They made presentations in Parliament and European Council in order to explain to European MPs and the leaders of those structures what is Ukrainian lustration. I'm very pleased to remember my meeting with the High Commission, with the European Commissioner on Human Rights, where Mr. Muzieks, when he heard that our law provides for the expulsion of KGB people from the former party and Komsomol leaders, from those who just watched how people were shot during Maidan and who were in power then, all the corruption is those who support the external aggression. He said that he will support this law. So all this important work is being done by Agnieszka's fund.
Actually, you have already spoken almost everything what I wanted to say. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Agnieszka Piasecka. I am a coordinator of the illustration project of the Open Dialogue Foundation. Next to the fact that we present what happens in Ukraine generally to the international audience, we also organize trips for Yegor and make him able to present the law on illustration, the draft law on illustration for the international audience, also to the members of the European Parliament and to plenty of other organizations. We also organized a team of experts that actually help to make this draft law better and better. These experts work for the Polish Institute of National Remembrance, but also for the Czech equivalent. These are Czech and Polish politicians who drafted the Polish and the Czech law on illustration. So we are actually doing our best to help to make this law also acceptable in terms of the norms of international regulations and to save Ukraine 20 years of development, actually, because this is how long all these changes took for Poland. This is how long all these changes took for plenty of other countries. And we would like to also state clearly that we are dissatisfied that the law was not accepted for voting today at Verkhovna Rada, because even if this project still needs to be improved, it should be accepted because it can also later be improved and make it even better. But this is the voice of Maidan. Illustration has to be performed, and if it's not performed quickly, if it's not performed now, probably, maybe it may not happen. And this is our stance. Thank you very much for your attention.
Є в когось запитання, будь ласка.
Any questions? Could you tell us about the election law? What are the motives on the part of MPs not to vote for these laws? How do you explain this? Well, in reality, everything is very simple. Regrettably, MPs are still sure that they decide something in this country. In reality, most of them have nothing to lose, because most of them do not have any chance to get to the new parliament according to the new results, to the new elections. This especially concerns first-past-the-post MPs, who have paid quite a lot for their elections, and they do not want to pay once more. More than that, at the condition of open lists or closed lists, MPs who were elected from territorial constituencies cannot calculate on high places, high ranks in the lists of parties who can overcome 5 or 3% threshold, and they are reading their political and politological books very badly, because they can become, in fact, steam engines for political forces. They don't understand this. They have not read a lot of books, both in their childhood and when they became MPs. Any other questions? My question is mostly to Yegor Sobolev. Could you tell me, please, new political parties like Samopotmich, VOLIA, Democratic Alliance, will take part in the parliamentary elections? Do you plan any sort of union in order to overcome this 3 or 5% threshold? Do you plan to join forces with Democratic Alliance? I am not an experienced politician, so I will tell you the truth, although it is bad truth. Regrettably, this joining forces is almost impossible. 2 weeks ago, we started negotiations with everyone whom you mentioned. We talked to Andriy Sadovy, Olga Bogomolets, Anatoly Gritsenko, Vasil Gatsko. As far as we were informed, Anatoly Gritsenko wants to run on the ballot of only his party. Same applies to Andriy Sadovy, Samopomich party. Democratic Alliance is thinking about a possibility to put their candidate on the list of Hromadянska Pozicija, and Olga Bogomolets is not yet defined. And of course, there are very low chances, but still they are, of new political forces to help reloading. But they are becoming lesser and lesser, and we are not helped by the current legislators because they are seriously talking about raising the financial guarantee for the participation of in the elections for a political party up to $1 million. If this is done, then my party will have to refuse to abandon elections because, you know, when people are now helping our heroes in Donbass, we are not going to go to people and ask them, give us $1 million to take part in the elections, then give us money to launch our ad campaign, then give us money for our observers. It turns out like we snatch this money from those people who are waging war to protect our country. I saw messages of my colleagues. The current elections is not the real election. This is a game for oligarchs. I have told my colleagues in the party that there should be, you know, a law that at least 2 oligarchs should recommend any party for the election. This is, of course, a sad joke. It is very, very expensive. So let's take recommendations for oligarchs so that everyone understands who runs for whom and who will lead a party. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.